In this episode, I'm going to show you how I photographed one of the most difficult interiors that I ever came across as a professional real estate photographer. I'm going to show you not just how I shot, lit, and edited this using flambient, I'm also going to show you an HDR alternative for each one of these photos. We'll start with this particular image here and just of this dining room. We're going to take a look at the outside of the dining room as well, but we're also going to take a look at something that was extremely difficult, and that's this one here, which is an all blue room. Now, this was shot for an interior designer, but even if it was done for a real estate listing, I would have used the same techniques because this is work that you charge by the hour for. Yes, it is more difficult no matter which method you use, whether it's flambient or HDR, and we're going to be comparing those as we go through the various layers, what you would do, how you would shoot it, and then eventually getting the final result. So we'll start here, and one of the keys to doing this, as I was doing flambient, is that, as you can see, there are really no ceilings to bounce any flash off of. So what I did was I used shoot-through umbrellas, and here's just some BTS of one of the shots. This was of the front room. This is just a single flash shot, and you can see I'm over here in the distance. I'm doing some other bouncing as I'm also lighting up this whole space. And you can tell by the reflection here in the window and the glass here that there was an umbrella in on a stand with a light there, and that was by my camera that happened to be an 8300. And over here, then I've got an 8200 and a shoot-through umbrella. Now this does wonders really for shedding light because there is nothing to bounce off of anyways, but instead of using like a mag mod or, for instance, the Gary Fong diffuser, both are really good, but in these cases, by using an umbrella, I can direct the light as I see fit to any part of the room. So this gets me exactly the light I want where I want it, but I still get it diffused. So for instance, when we take a look at this dining room, this is just one of many shots that were done using flash. And you can see that I've got a flash and a shoot-through umbrella here, but I can take multiple shots with this and know exactly where my light is going. And then I can control it as I see fit. So it gives me a lot of control on how I want to light this. Now, this is once again an extreme case because most houses just don't have curved wooden ceilings. They don't have this Venetian plaster on their walls. They don't have all these multitudes of colors where there's even nothing really white to even gauge off of for getting the correct white balance. So by using this technique of shoot-through umbrellas, it's unique to flambient, but it's not the only way that you have to do it. I prefer to do it this way because I'm going to get highly accurate results, but if you couldn't do it, then there is an HDR alternative. Now you can see here, there's quite a difference in this, but when we get to some of the other shots here, you'll see there isn't quite as big of a difference, and I'm going to go through why that is, especially here when this is a flambient shot, this is the HDR version. Yes, the flambient's going to get you better results most of the time, and in some cases, it will get you extremely high results that are just hard to imitate using HDR, and I'm going to go through that in depth. But because there are a couple ways to approach this, that's why I teach both throughout my courses on real estate photography. So just real quick before moving on, if you're not familiar, I do have a variety of courses on doing real estate photography, including the flambient techniques, which would be covered in my professional interiors course. When we're talking about high-end HDR, that's when we're looking at my course on expert editing, which has a lot of other information in there as well for doing editing, but I've also got a course on exteriors, videography, business and marketing, and I've got also books on real estate photography as well, and I have links to all that down in the description of this video. Moving along here though on what it took to do this, let's first take a look at the flambient, then we'll take a look at the HDR. So you can see there are a number of layers here that were involved because there were also color corrections, a lot that I cover in the expert editing course. But here, this is your standard flambient. If I go down to the bottom, you can see this was shot with two shoot-through umbrellas. One is near the camera, pointing into the room, and one is over here. And so that's casting some shadows, and it's one of the downfalls of using than shoot through umbrellas. But I've got at least good light. I know I've got good color. I'm dominating this instead of trying to use an ambient shot, which would have looked like this or maybe looked like this. You can see there is a huge amount of light disparity, and we're going to be covering this when we get to the HDR technique. But looking at flambient, starting out with just a good flash base with no ambient light, look how clean the floor is. I'm not getting a lot of artifacts that we'll see when we go to the HDR version. Going back to our other layers though, I needed to light this up, so what I did was I flashed this space over here so that I can use a light and blending mode to bring that in. And then we get into the everyday typical flambient. You've seen me do this a lot of times probably on this channel. It's covered throughout my books and courses. That's where we add ambient luminance. That's what this is here from an ambient shot, but it's only 50%. And you can see that I've also erased some of it off of here so that I don't have all that luminance. I don't have all the natural light. I can then keep adding more as I see fit with duplicate ambient layers and even one to brighten up this a little bit. Now, one of the downfalls of you doing a room like this that's very opulent, it's got so much wood and so many colors, is that there is inevitably going to be some color corrections. They're minimal if you're using flash, but you can see that's what these layers were for here. So this layer here was for over on this side. If I take a look at that mask, you can see I'm able to bring the browns back into here and also on the floor. If we turn that off, we can turn that layer on and off and see how that improved that area. Typical color correction stuff, that's even covered to a large degree in the professional interior course, but to a larger degree also in expert editing. Then of course I wanted to touch up the chairs just a little bit and this pillow. That's what this layer was for here. And then here, this was just some minor stuff that I just wanted to just fix up here on this floor. A lot of people might not notice that, but I just took it to the nth degree. And then just a few corrections, for instance, to get rid of this shadow, just use the remove tool on a separate layer. And then I wanted to richen up the floor. So this is a technique I use sometimes, and that's just to use a levels layer. So using this levels layer with that masked in, I'm able to then lower the levels. You can see just a little bit on the dark so that I can just richen that up just a bit. Minor adjustments, but the big one here is that to get the view to the outside, I'm able to do a darken mode window pull. That's me just directing a flash here and of course having that in darken mode. Then doing this so much in Photoshop, then a lot of times I'll just make a smart object of the stamp layers and do my final post adjustments here instead of in Lightroom like I normally do in the standard editing workflow for real estate. So this looks good already, but then I decided to do some other color corrections, and that's all that these layers are here. So this is the final image then, but you can see that the key here before getting to the HDR option was that I started with a flash base, which allowed me to get then these clean results. So now let's take a look if we did this in HDR. Now the HDR here isn't going to be quite as good as what we can do on some of the other images. And that's because of this huge amount of light disparity. Let's just recover that again. So what we've got here, this is very typical of doing the high-end HDR method where I suggest having a very bright exposure. And then you've got an exposure here, which would be kind of your medium exposure. And then using the exposure blending techniques that I show in the expert editing course, then of course you can get something that's fairly even. But we've got a lot of problems with a lot of reflection on these hardwood floors, and that's just something you can't almost avoid with HDR. With flash you can, you just eliminate all that ambient light and just provide your own with flash. So there are darker exposures to try to fill in that. That's what this is here, but you can see that you're still going to get really bad casts coming in from outside. So here then, I darkened it up a little bit on the outside, doing somewhat of a window pull, which is a very dark exposure to bring that through. But you can see because of the amount of light disparity, we're getting some very bad results here on the wood, here on the door, a lot of bloom coming in, and a lot of bloom, especially on the floor. So these are things that are very hard to avoid with HDR. They go away immediately if you're using flambient. Then a few other layers to try to adjust it. So here's a color fill layer to try to adjust the floor. And just like I did with my flambient shot, I did a levels layer to richen it up, but it's still not enough to get rid of what washed out here on the floor. So I did some final adjustments here, once again with a stamp layer, and this turned out pretty good. I mean, if it was for a listing photo, it's passable. For an interior designer, there's just no way. And my clients, even my real estate clients, would be paying me by the hour to do this as a listing. This still would not be acceptable. But once again, this is a very difficult HDR case, and not every single one is going to be like that. A couple advantages, though, that came in here is I didn't have to worry about shadows being cast from a shoot-through umbrella, and I didn't have to do any color corrections in the far room. Still, there were more things that were difficult to work with here than compared to if I had done a flambient shot for this room. So let's move on to the next photo. So this is the finished flambient image. This is what I delivered to my client. If we were to try to do this in HDR, it can get somewhat close results, but we can see the problem here if we take a look at just one ambient layer. So this is an ambient layer, and you can see the intense amount of light disparity where things are completely blown out into the whites. And if we try to add then some other darker exposures like here, where this is exposing fairly well for the pool table, it just isn't exposing well for anything else. But once again, using then this type of luminosity masking, the type of exposure blending like I show in my expert editing course, then you can start bringing in these darker exposures without getting something that is completely dark or blown out. But we still don't have everything done here. We can once again bring in our final adjustments here like I did before, and then we can also do some color corrections. For instance, here I did some color corrections for the floor. I did some color corrections up here for these chairs. But the windows, no matter what, are very difficult to get, and we also have a lot of other problems. Let's take a look at the flambient and compare the two. Taking a look at the flambient version, we can see that immediately the color of the walls and the ceilings are consistent compared to if we take a look at the HDR, which has tons of casts. It's not just from the yellow lights. Look at this. Red is reflecting over here because it's coming off of the floor. Might be some coming off the chairs. We can also see still a lot of bloom around this window because once again, we're up against this intense light disparity. Going back over here to flambient, we can take a look at what it took. All I did was take a shot like this with flash. That's all it was to get me a color base. And this was shot with two shoot-through umbrellas, one on each side of the camera. They were pointing just straight into the room just so that I could get enough color here. I've got a little bit of a flare here that I edited out. But I've got enough color here across there where my color is consistent. My color is accurate, and I don't have so much intense light disparity. Then I can bring in some ambient luminance, and that's what this is. If I had all the luminance in here, this is 70%, and I edited some of it out, but that already gets me a lot closer. Then there's also a darker luminance here that I did for the floor. This is just a darker ambient shot where I just then took this so that I could edit some of this in. And then just some color fill layers. Once again, doing a little bit for the floor, doing stuff here for, I was underneath of here on the pool table, and then darken mode window pulls. Doing these darken mode window pulls for here and here, I don't have to worry about bloom and flare and all that around the windows. It all goes away because that's done with flash, and I also don't have to cut in any windows. So that's what this was here, taking care of all these various layers, and then I just provided some final adjustments. This was probably deliverable, but I decided to do just a few things. One, I wanted to get rid of that flare up there, so I did that on a separate layer using the remove tool. And then here, I just wanted to clean up the couch just a little bit, and then also then just a few things like for the chairs, a little bit also on the wood for the chairs, and then a little bit more on the floor and on the table here, and then richening up the floor a little bit with a levels layer like I did on some of those other ones. But the thing is here is I've got a much cleaner looking picture with correct colors. And you'll notice here, if I go over to the HDR photo, the couch here looks like it's the same color as the walls, but it wasn't. If we take a look at what it was with true flash, you can see that it actually was a shade of green. So that's why I love to use flash and I use flambient. Now I understand that yes, it can be a little overwhelming if you've never learned it before, and it does take a while to learn and then practice and get it down right. But you get these type of clean results compared to if you tried to do it HDR. But either way, if you're up against a circumstance like this, you could do HDR. The next one will be a little bit easier doing HDR, but once again, this is the flambient shot and it's very clean. If we take a look at the HDR image, we can see that we've still got some issues with a lot of light coming in here. Bloom, very difficult to get the floors very accurate, where with the flambient, there really wasn't that issue. But this also wasn't a very easy flambient to do, shooting through these marble archways and then having all these various colors throughout. What I did though was I started with this flash base. And you can see here, I have a flash that's shooting into here. It's on the other side of an archway. I've got near the camera, and then also here this shoot through umbrella. And then I just added some other images here. This just edited that side out, typical two-sided composite. And then light and blending mode was done here for this pop. And then I did some selective flambient. Having this color base then to work with, I've got something that is much better already than a finished HDR image. This makes it then much easier to work with, as I can richen up the floor like I did here. I can add color to it. I can change various hues and saturation around here, typical color correction stuff. And then I can still even add more flambient. This is me adding a little bit more luminosity from one of the ambient shots, only its luminance, not its color, over top of the dining room table. Then the tricky part here was to get the view outside with a darken mode window pull, but all I had to do was a darken mode window pull. If we take a look at this in normal mode, we can see that I was flashing toward that. I also have a flash going here, and then using darken mode, then all that stuff goes away, and then I've got a view to the outside for that window. Very, very simple thing to do. I don't have to cut out anything. The wood color is preserved. I'm not worried about bloom because I already have that area flashed. So all that comes together real nicely. Now, there once again was a lot of other color adjustments that kind of had to go into this. Here was my initial final adjustments, but I still wanted to correct the color on the chairs, so I did this. And then just a few other small things. For instance, this big glare down here, well, I decided to take that out. Very simple with the remove tool. And then I added a little bit more color back into the walls here. That was by using this in a color mode here. So a little bit trickier to do this, but basically the same steps were done then when we went into HDR. The difference here was I started out something very light, and once again I take a darker exposure and I do this then type of luminosity masking in the high-end HDR technique to then bring out something workable. But you can see that it's still not getting the correct colors. I've got a lot of bloom that's going on here. So when I do my final adjustments, stuff just isn't really working very well. So there's a lot of extra editing that would have to go into this to make it even acceptable for a designer, or let alone for a listing. But a lot of stuff you can do. For instance, here I removed that reflection, just like I did before with the remove tool. I used the curves layer to darken this up, and then I added some color back on top of it. So that got me pretty close to what I needed for this. And like I said, if this was for a real estate listing, this might be quite acceptable. But for a designer, this would be really what they're looking for. It's a lot more color correct. It doesn't have weird stuff going on. But this was that borderline case. If we recap and go back to one of the more difficult ones once we're inside of the dining room, there's really no comparison. This really did require flambient. Trying to get an HDR out of this, now that we can see the entire room, it's very difficult. When most of that room was then hidden when we were doing the HDR, it's not as noticeable because the marble archways and all this is definitely more prominent in the photo. But once we're inside of that room, the HDR just isn't working, but flambient does a much better job in this case. And it was kind of borderline when we talk about these two rooms, whether using flambient here or using HDR, what would have been better? What would have been acceptable? Well, the fact is, it doesn't really take that long to do flambient on site, no matter the technique, even if you're using these shoot-through umbrellas. The key, though, is that the editing goes much faster and then you get a higher quality result. But knowing how to do both is key. Yes, it was very difficult to shoot this particular house, and I knew that I could do it, though, using the flash that I have. No matter what I come across, no matter what the design, no matter the colors, no matter the amount of light or shadows in any image at all, by using flash, I know that I can get good, high quality, color accurate results every single time. If I didn't have time to put all the lights up, for instance, if this was some type of amenity, then I would be doing some type of HDR, but I would put a lot more effort into it to try to get something a lot more workable. But this is also why I teach both of these methods in my courses, because not everybody might feel comfortable with using flash or have the time to be able to do it. And if you don't, then there are acceptable means by using high-end HDR. Not your typical HDR, but by using high-end HDR, you can still get fairly acceptable results.